he is. So Neil King.
So we're going to do a quick sound check.
Sounds like a hostile audience.
Sound check. 10,
Hey,
9,
go,
8,
go,
7,
go.
6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. How's that? All right.
How about...
Oh,
That's
you
the
can hear me.
microphone.
Well, good evening. I'm Marianne Brownlow, and welcome to Hill Center and to Talk of the Hill with host Bill Press, veteran journalist, political commentator, author. Before Hill Center really even opened, Bill had an idea that he wanted to sort of create and host an in-depth conversation that he would moderate with, distinguished guests. And over the years, there have been so many very distinguished guests, but I have to say, I think no one more distinguished than our guest this evening.
absolutely.
Wow.
Former Wall Street Journal editor, political editor, and reporter Neil King. He has just published this extraordinary book, American Ramble, A Walk of Memory and Renewal. East City Bookshop has copies for sale. And Neil will be signing the book afterwards. I'm sure you all have seen that it's just the reviews have been overwhelmingly positive, to say the least. So without further ado, please welcome Neil King and Bill Press.
Thank you, Marianne, and good evening, everybody. It's great to see you all. Thank you for coming this evening. I want to say a big welcome first to our friends here at the Hill Center. I don't know what number of Talk of the Hills this is, but they're always fun and exciting, and none more, as Marianne said, than tonight. I also want to welcome all of our friends from C-SPAN who are watching on C-SPAN around the country, around the world tonight. Thank you for C-SPAN for covering our event tonight. It's very appropriate that C-SPAN is here. The Talk of the Hill program started at the Hill 10, maybe 11 years ago now. We've had many, many programs. Our very first guest was Brian Lamb, the founder of C-SPAN.
Yes.
Yeah, so come full circle having them tonight. And I also want to take a chance to welcome all of those people who will be listening to tonight's interview on my podcast, the Bill Press Pod. That's the shameless plug. The Bill Press Pod, wherever you listen to your podcast, I'm there, and our conversation this evening will be part of that podcast as well. And as such, in terms of welcome, such a great treat to welcome a good friend and a good neighbor, Neil King, who a couple of years ago did this crazy thing of walking out his front door and walking to Central Park, New York. Now, there are a lot easier ways to get there, as we know, but no way more exciting, no way filled with more adventures than Neil discovered and writes all about and relates to us in this wonderful, wonderful book, American Ramble. I liked it so much, I've read it twice.
Wow.
So I encourage you to at least read it once. And again, East City Books is here. There'll be copies for you to buy and for Neil to sign right after the program. So Neil, let's get started. You live 2 blocks away, right?
I live, yes, just down 9th Street, which is right there, yes.
Yeah. Did you walk over tonight?
Are you kidding? No, I took it over, yeah.
I just want to be sure. Start us off, page 11, if you will.
Okay.
When you walked out the
Yeah.
door, and just set the scene here for us.
I will say that of all the events that might have occurred at the Hill Center, or all the books that any of you have read, this book has the distinction of starting and finishing on 9th Street. So, and any of us who live on 9th Street, we know what an honor that is. So, the beginning of this book has a section called the preamble. I walk out my door, and then I spend a lot of time talking about why I've walked out my door, and the history of the territory in between, and
We'll get to that.
well, I'll get right, but I just want to get to the portion I'm going to read here, because this is at the very end of that chapter. I set out that Monday morning, 9 days into spring, north up 9th Street, eager to see if anything of interest might crop up along the way. As I turned to wave to Shayla, the Marine Corps barracks 5 blocks away broke out in a recorded rendition of the Star-Spangled Banner through the loudspeakers of the Commandant's mansion, as they did every morning at 8 sharp. It was a brassy version in the style of Sousa, and to those strains I padded the first blocks of an arching path over rivers and freeways and farmlands to where the Hudson spills into that big harbor with Lady Liberty and her torch. The sun hung warm over my shoulder. There was bird song in the trees. I had a skip in my step and a satchel on my back and could feel within blocks a little bliss seeping in.
What a great beginning. So one word could wrap us up like for the entire evening. Let's not take that long on it. But why?
It started as an idea right over there one morning where I said, what if I just navigated as a pedestrian to New York City and didn't take I-95, didn't go to Union Station, didn't take the Acela? What would the pedestrian experience be? And so that festered for a while, and then I read more and thought more about the land in between and how others had taken that same trip. And by the time March of 2021 rolled around, I had done tons of preparation, and it became something I just absolutely had to do.
Well, so the route you took, you deliberately decided you would not take anything close to 95, right?
Very
You
deliberately.
wanted to go kind of the roundabout way, which you did. We'll get into that. Again, why that route?
Yeah, it's funny because, I come out on my street, if I took a right and came this and went down Pennsylvania Avenue, and
Yeah,
I thought
you
about that, to go over the Chesapeake and then up the
Right.
Eastern Shore Mill and then across and up the Jersey Shore, and I was like, that would be a week and a half of ocean and Jersey Shore. It's like, no, that's not interesting. And the more I thought about the route, the more I realized I had to go through Pennsylvania. I had to go to Lancaster County where the Amish and Mennonites are. I had to cross the Mason-Dixon line on an important part of the Mason-Dixon line. I had to go to Valley Forge. I had to cross the Delaware where Washington did. Certain things just sort of fell into place that were must stops.
How long did it take you to plan it?
In various ways, it took basically a year. I was going to walk out my door March 2020, but something happened. It didn't disrupt my life, by the way. So I had to scratch it, and I decided to postpone it for exactly a year. So I walked out my door on the 29th of March of 2021. In between those two dates, everything unimaginable had happened, including a couple of months before I left, the whole insurrection at the Capitol. So I walked into a world that was profoundly changed since when I had originally planned to do it. And so it increased the number of things to think about by magnitudes.
You took off for 26 days. Did you take a lot of shit with you?
No, I took very little with me. I didn't camp. So the fact that I was sleeping in Airbnbs and inns and things, I had to plot those places, which was not easy. So I went light. I had 16 pounds or so. I had a fly rod to do some fishing. I had one pair of shoes.
One pack.
One pack, yeah, it was not large. It was, I said satchel. It was like Huck Finn or something.
How many pairs of shoes did you wear out?
Just one. I only wore the one pair.
Really?
Yeah.
The whole time? Huh?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, we've talked a little bit about this. I'm a big fan of travel writers, and have read a lot of them. Some of the old-fashioned ones like H.B. Morton, Eric Newby, or today's travel writers, Bill Bryson, Paul Theroux. Have you read them, and did they inspire you? Were you kind of following their lead?
Yeah, well, my list would be slightly different. I'm a huge fan of, for instance, Bruce Chatwin, or Patrick Leigh Fermor, who wrote a fantastic, but the reading I did do that really did inspire me and kind of set the stage for the walk was the whole stream of writers that had come to the United States in the 1820s, 30s, 40s, and had done basically what I was doing, which is to travel slowly through an important part of the country to figure out this place. And would we last, and could this young country made up of all these languages and creeds and races and everything ever form into one union? And Alexis de Tocqueville was a famous member of that tribe, but there were so many that came, and I read dozens of those books, and my attitude was similar to theirs. I wanted to go out as if I wasn't already hugely familiar with the landscape and the people in between, which I really in a lot of ways wasn't, and make up my mind about various things by going through it.
There's so many different levels to the book, which, there we go. I really enjoy, I mean, so many interesting places you walk to, and learned a lot about. So many interesting people that you encountered all the way. And then kind of the big picture, so many life lessons that you came back with. So let's start with some of the interesting places. You talk about Lancaster Junction. To me, that railroad.
Oh, the Hanover Junction. Yeah,
Hanover Junction, I'm sorry. Yeah. Tell us a little
Yeah,
about
I mean,
that.
this was one of the things where I had decided, I had read how there's a junction, there's a train station. And this was one of the first rail lines built in the United States. I think it was completed from Baltimore to York in 1834. And in 1863, Abraham Lincoln took that line, and at the Hanover Junction, there's a line that goes this way that takes the trains to Gettysburg. And he paused there for half an hour or so. He was actually waiting for the governor of Pennsylvania to show up, which he didn't. And then a year and a half later, Lincoln was on a train that went this way and kept going straight on this very long route to take him, then in a casket, to Springfield for his burial. And there was something that was just fascinating about that station and the fact that those two sets of tracks diverged there. And that was sort of one of my pilgrimage destinations, was to go to that station and think about those two things.
Yeah. You also, Lancaster, I got that mixed up there earlier, and learned a lot about President Buchanan.
Yeah.
Only president, I think, to come from Pennsylvania.
Until Joe Biden, if you count him.
Well, I'm sorry, I'm from Delaware.
Oh, right, sorry, okay, yeah.
I was from Delaware, right. Okay. We forget about Scranton.
Right, yeah, right.
Buchanan, and then Thaddeus Stevens, whom I'd never heard of
Yeah.
before. And you talk a lot about Buchanan and Stevens.
Yeah, so one of the things that was great about the walk, part of the memory in the subtitle wasn't really my memory so much, it was a national memory, like who is it that we remember and why? And when I walked into Lancaster, they were actively debating who to rename one of the elementary schools after, because they wanted to take James Buchanan's name off, he being the last president before Lincoln, and one of these dough-faced Democrats who was a slave-owning coddler of the Confederacy, well, would be soon to be Confederacy, and a moral coward, essentially. And ever since he had died, they had meticulously looked after his mansion, and you could visit it, and the Junior League had been very attentive to that. And Thaddeus Stevens, who had lived in the same town at the same time when Buchanan was president, Thaddeus Stevens was the head of the Ways and Means Committee in the House, and was way more righteous than Abraham Lincoln or almost anybody else in Congress, and was Lincoln's conscience in a lot of ways. He was the one who really pushed Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation and so on. And they were just then getting underway to sort of rehabilitate his house. And it's now soon going to become a museum and what it should be, which is like a civil rights destination. But Thaddeus Stevens is one of the great figures of the 19th century, a person of hundreds of times more importance than James Buchanan. And James Buchanan, at least in that place, has been held up until now. He's finally, rightfully, they didn't have to tear his statue down, but if there had been one, I would have been fine with replacing it with Thaddeus Stevens' statue,
You walked into the middle of this debate,
yeah,
which was really great. I mean, it seems that you'll find out when you read the book, that every city you went to, every town you went to, you connected with the town historian, right, who told you the history of the place and showed you the places that you should see in terms of learning our history.
Yeah, precisely.
Right.
Yeah.
Gettysburg.
Well, oh, yeah, I did not go to Gettysburg. You're talking about Valley Forge.
Valley Forge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Valley Forge was a really fascinating thing to me because, so I'm sure many of you are familiar, but so Valley Forge, the winter of 1777-78, Continental Army at wit's end. They don't even have shoes. They have nothing but hardtack to eat. They're falling apart. The British have taken over huge portions of the country, and they're in Philadelphia all sitting around fires, and the Continental Army is freezing in Valley Forge. I went to Valley Forge, and I met an historian there who agreed to meet me, and she had written a book about what I was interested in, which was not that winter. It was when we decided to care about that winter. And it took us basically a century to care about that winter. And we kind of needed to have that moment in the late 1800s where all these various kind of Victorian sensibilities and other things came together, and we needed this symbol of grit and persistence and sticking it out, and Valley Forge became that place. And so it's a fascinating thing that, you know, we codified, speaking of Gettysburg, Gettysburg became a memorial immediately after that battle, and 13 years before Valley Forge became like a thing of importance. And it's morphed many times since then and now become a huge national park, which didn't happen until Gerald Ford, actually. But that to me was also, you know, I was walking through a landscape where we had been fighting over what statues should be torn down or not, and were we erasing history or not erasing history. And the reality is, history is a very fluid thing, always has been, and sometimes it takes us a long time to acknowledge that certain things happen, and the fact that some people are being erased or their statues are being torn down is part of that process.
Right. So there's so many other historical places, particularly Revolutionary War. You're crossing the Delaware. There was Trenton, boom, boom, boom. And then, to me, one of the most interesting places was the Great Mound.
The Great Mound. Yeah, I had, on a drive back from New York down to Washington, you know, if you take the Jersey Turnpike, you'll see these things that we're not so proudly building, but we are building, which are these trash mounds, these landfills. And I saw one of them, I was like, wow, very active landfill. I want to go to the top of that landfill. So I sent them an email.
A dump.
A dump, yeah, but it's quite a structure that we're building. And you can see it right there by the Raritan River. So they said, yeah, sure, we'd love to take you to the top of it. So I arrived there, and you know, I went up as the explorer, and it was from the top of that landfill that I got my first glimpse 32 miles away of the tiny, tiny glimmer of Manhattan. But, you know, I muse a bit in the book about how if you go to the Grand Canyon, and at the top, you're in the present, and within about 5 minutes, you've walked out of all of human history, and you go down about 1.9 billion years in geological time. The landfill, you started at like the Eisenhower administration, and then you walked up, and at one point, I stopped, I said, where are we now? And the guy said, about 2006. And I was like, wow, that's Enron, George Bush, second term. You know. And then the present is when you get there and the trucks are dumping the stuff, and it's sort of fun to make fun of, but it's not so funny. But it's just to see the immensity of this. This is one county's creation.
Right.
Well, yeah.
And this is still an active landfill, and it's
Very.
Still, yeah.
And the guy that I went up with had gone to Ohio State University, and when we were walking up, I said, you know, there's this culture 1,000 years ago that built mounds all around the Ohio River Valley and down the Mississippi. Some of you we should all be aware of these places. And he said, oh, I know. I went to Ohio State University, and he then started telling me about those mounds. And he said, our mounds are not like those mounds.
So many interesting places and so many interesting people. So you're walking along, you've got a water bottle, and your water bottle's empty, and you're thirsty.
Oh, yeah.
And you encounter a very interesting individual. All you want is to fill your water bottle.
Yeah.
Not so easy, right? Tell us.
You know, it was one of the things that really was amazing was that by the second day, it only took 2 days for me to realize that when you go out on a walk like this, where you have a destination and it's going to take weeks to get there, you start to experience what are like bona fide parables. Like you have encounters with people along the road and you're like, wow, this stands for something more than just this thing. And so that afternoon I was walking along and my water bottle was empty. And I'm walking through this really rich new subdivision of these huge mansions that have been built outside of Baltimore. And this young guy in his 30s came down his drive, and there's the big house. And my bottle was empty, and I said, do you have any idea where I can get some water? Was my question. I asked it that way intentionally, as opposed to, could you please fill my water? And so he said, and he gave me these very elaborate directions to this place that was like 2 miles away. And I said, wow, okay, thanks, I appreciate that. And I started walking, and then he said, oh, by the way, I would advise you be careful. And I said, what should I be careful of? And he said, well, there are going to be people in this neighborhood that are going to be a little wondering why you're just walking through the neighborhood. And I said, really, are they? And I told him then this story about this guy, Paul Selipek, who's now walking like around the world, essentially. And when he walked across the country of Georgia 54 nights, every night, he was put up spontaneously by the people in Georgia. And I said, so anyway, and I ended up walking away. Oh, but when I was leaving the guy, he said, oh, one thing. I just want you to know, when I said be careful, I wasn't talking about me. I think you're fine. I was warning you about the other people in the neighborhood. And in the book, I then go on to muse about our version of hospitality. You go back and look at any of the holy books. It's about how do you treat the stranger who comes down the road. And, you know, in our case, we basically turned hospitality into an industry, and rightfully, I then filled my water bottle at Dunkin' Donuts, which is where you're supposed to get water, right?
It never occurred to him to say, oh, here.
No, and I didn't ever, I kept thinking, because it took me like 45 minutes to get out of this ghastly place, and I kept thinking, he's going to show up at any moment, right? Like, wait, it just struck me, here's some water. I've got plenty of water, but.
No. Never did.
No, it didn't happen. No.
To me, one of the most magical moments in the book is when you're walking through the Quaker, the Mennonite country, and you come to some kids playing ball, which turned out to be quite a visit, right?
Yeah. That was one of these moments. I mean, I just want to impart one obvious fact, but I can't overstate it. Walking is, you might say, 20 times slower than driving 3 miles versus 60 miles an hour. It's hundreds of times more meaningful, hundreds of times richer. And all of these experiences that I had, some of them were just walking and noticing and watching a spring unfold, right? I'd never done that before, like literally just spent a month watching a spring happen. But you also have these encounters that you would never have noticed. This wouldn't have happened. So I'm walking up a road, I look over, and I see beside a school, there's just a woman, young woman, she's like 9th grade or so, and she's standing there with a long floral dress on, she has a head bonnet on, and she has a baseball mitt on her hand. And then I hear this whack, and she backs up and she catches this fly softball, and she hurls it back the other way, and I'm like, what is going on? So I go into the playground, and these Mennonite kids are having this huge game, 2 games of softball. All the young women are wearing these ankle-length dresses, and they are amazing softball players, like full out, sliding into second base and the whole thing. And so at the end of they stop playing, they all come over towards me, their teacher comes over, and in terms of the whole welcoming of a stranger, the first thing he said, what brings you here? And I told him, and he said, kids, gather around, let's hear what Mr. King has to say. And it was like, tell us what you're doing. And I started to talk to them. They were kind of taken aback by my commentary about just seeing their part of the country. And then one of the young women stepped forward and she said, Mr. Weaver, could we sing for Mr. King? And he said, do you have time? And I said, yeah, I've got time. And so I went into their school. We went down to the basement. They got on the risers. There were about 30 of them. And they sang these 2 incredible hymns of the afterlife, which was so bizarre because these are like, 14-year-olds on a beautiful spring day, and they're singing about their longing for heaven. But anyway, and it was the fullest, just most spontaneous, saying of thanks to me that I was there and that I had come and was interested in them. Basically, it was so extraordinary. And one last thing, when I was leaving, then all this hullabaloo occurred, and then I went up and I was going to fill my water bottle out of their drinking fountain, and Mr. Weaver goes back into the class, and instead of saying anything about me or anything, the first words out of his mouth are, "Well, as you know, we were working on our vocabulary, so if you'd turn to page 36, let's go back to it." And I was like, wow, because they're just so in the moment. They're just so focused on things. It was phenomenal.
What a magic moment.
Yeah.
So, from the guy who won't fill your water bottle, tell us about Peggy Brennan. She was also one of the characters,
Oh, wow, that's so
unforgettable
funny.
characters
Yeah.
in the book.
Well, that I'll do. So the whole walk, I'm this walking person, and out there, because if you go out on a big odyssey like Odysseus or a knight or whatever, there has to be a dragon of some kind or something, a cyclops or something, and the dragon was I-95, right? It was like, how am I going to confront and deal with I-95? And so I took this whole arcing path, and then I had identified Cranberry, New Jersey, is this perfectly preserved 19th century town, the midway point between New York and Philadelphia on the old postal route. And to the right of it, or the east of it, are all these warehouses, Amazon, Wayfair, all this kind of stuff in the woods. And then running between them is this brook. And I had found, before I even left, I was like looking on Google Maps, I said, oh, I'll go there, I'll talk to the town fathers and the historic preservation people, and then I'll make my way up that river, and I'll go under the turnpike by water underneath it. So when I'm talking to them this beautiful morning, and I tell them my plan, and this woman, Peggy Brennan, who's well into her 80s, she said, that's not going to work. And I said, why? And she said, it's not. It's all water. There's no room for a pedestrian. But I have an idea. And so she gets up, and she gets her phone out, and she calls her son. And 10 minutes later, her son shows up, and he says, follow me. And we go to his house. He pulls a kayak out from under his house. They take me to the lake, and like 6 of them, I get in the kayak, and they're all waving goodbye to me while I'm kayaking up this brook. After he had told me I was going to have to go over this impediment, all these trees would have fallen, this. But when I finally get over all of them, then I'll be able to go into the turnpike. And it was all the fact that she concocted this plan that became one of the great moments of the whole trip, was paddling up the Amazon, as I called it, into Amazonia.
So then, we want to leave room for your questions, but let's talk a little bit about the lessons that you learned.
Oh, yeah.
What'd you learn about the American people?
I mean, I was never on a scientific mission to come out with a statistically accurate sampling of Americans that would lead me to some firm conclusion. But one of the things, and this is on the one hand sort of obvious but needs to be said all the same, that if you go and stand with people on their patch of earth, their common ground that you share with them at that time, and have interactions with people who might be basically residing in another century or certainly have distinctly different political views from your own. In that setting, you're dealing with a fully rounded person, right? With everything else about them that's not just 3 or 4 of their political beliefs. And I met quite a few people whose politics did not align with mine. But to a person, they all had other characters and traits and things that were just so amusing and funny and so it was the other side that we've almost forgotten now that we're breaking into the tribes that we're breaking into. And, one guy I met who was an auctioneer who had all kinds of pronounced views on things that certainly didn't align with mine. And I met him in his barn filled with all these incredible vintage tractors. And he just then started telling me about the tractors. And it was such a great encounter. So, there's a world out there, and that was my desire, was to pay very particular attention to the particulars that I saw and to put out of mind the more sort of abstract things that we fill our heads with, that fill us with a certain kind of anxiety or venom. And I'm not saying that's the real America, but I am saying to do that for a spell really opens your eyes to a different slice of the country.
I was struck by your summing up on page 340. The love you feel for your country can deepen along with the knowledge of the shameful things we've done. There is ugliness, but also beauty in the ugliness. What we remember of an era may reflect more than anything our desire to give it the best gloss.
Yeah. No, I am a firm believer, I know there are certain governors scattered around the country that think they've figured out our, the mystery to our history or what we should be teaching the children about our past. And anyone that thinks they've figured that out hasn't given it ample time because it's such a complicated thing. But the one thing I do know is if you don't do the valley of shame part of it, and it's a long and dark one, and it's an ongoing one, and I encounter things almost every week in reading that I'm like, we did that, If you don't continually do that, then you don't come out the other side to have a love for this country that is founded in the reality. And it's the people that believe that if you have a shame for your country, then you're not patriotic, you don't properly love it, it's just such nonsense. I think it's exactly the other way around, that by acknowledging and fully absorbing those aspects of our past is how you have a better or higher respect for where we've come and where we are now.
So every one of the travel books that we've talked about, including yours, is a discovery of a certain country, a certain region. It's also self-discovery.
Yeah.
What'd you learn about yourself?
Well, I mean,
26 days walking by yourself. You had a lot of time,
Yeah.
right, to think?
I had some really amazing moments of joy along the way, and these sort of rapturous moments that I think came about largely because I just decided I would devote myself to paying attention and not listening to anything, no music, no podcast. And it had an accumulative effect over those days. And it really did become kind of a religious experience, certainly a very spiritual one, so that by the time I got to New York, I just felt that I was sort of glowing, and there was kind of a radiance about things that a lot of that is, I still think is there in a way. I mean, it's a funny thing to say, well, you walk out your door. The one thing I'll say...
You've got your book there, because you talk about that rapture, which
Okay.
came at a very unusual place.
Okay.
Walking
all right,
across the Bayonne Bridge.
Yeah, exactly. There's actually a chapter that's called Rapture on the Bayonne Bridge. And when I was going up the Bayonne Bridge, I wasn't really looking for Manhattan. It was right there. And when I looked up and saw it, I was overwhelmed by the sight of Manhattan. And it is, by the way, we've done a lot of disservice to this continent by a lot of the things that we humans have done. But one distinct service we've done is build the city of Manhattan, because it is a gorgeous thing, And when you see it on a spring morning with the river there and the harbor there, and that thing we built, and you can go back and read all the F. Scott Fitzgerald you want, where he talks about, and many others, about that gorgeous site. And it was a gorgeous site. So I described here, this weird rapture, though, went beyond mere gratification. I had seen this skyline before. 1,000 times over the years, I had caught sight of it from all directions as a cab driver and a common traveler. But on this morning, the sight of it physically astonished and stunned me. The days and all those steps had pried open a part of the human spirit that magnifies the potency of otherwise simple things and grants the commonplace a touch of the divine.
Beautiful, yeah. So the second time through your book, I suddenly said, you know what? I remember now something that really struck me once about Union Station. Okay, so I went back to Union Station to double check it. And there if you're facing Union Station, on the upper left side of Union Station is this quote from Samuel Johnson. So it is in traveling. A man must carry knowledge with him if he would bring home knowledge?
That's fascinating because I actually talk in here where I say
Just
the meaning you bring.
Does that fit after your experience?
Absolutely, no.
from-
And,
yeah.
you know, to the extent that if somebody says, oh, ramble, so you rambled, how do you ramble? What qualifies as a ramble? My thing is you pick a place that is important to you, doesn't matter how far away it is. You leave your house to get to it, because I think that continuity of where you live your normal life and this place you want to go to is really important. And you spend a certain amount of time, preferably months, really studying and thinking about and steeping yourself in what's in between, the stories, the travel logs, the who moved there when, the geology. And the more meaning you bring with you, the more meaning you get in return. It's a trade. And it's not just the people you meet, it's when you arrive at the Susquehanna River and you've read a lot about that river and you know how old that river is and you fully respect that river, it pays you back when you arrive at it, and it gives you things in return. It's a transaction.
The only regret is that we all couldn't go with Neil on an American Ramble.
Thank you.
Questions about the road, the people, the places,
There was a question, right?
we have to, please use the microphone so that C-SPAN can pick up your questions. Do we have another microphone over here, or just one? Just the one. Okay, good. Yeah, please.
Have you heard from anybody since the book has come out, any of the people you encountered?
That's a really interesting question because,
Everybody hear the question?
yeah.
More importantly, have you heard from the water guy from outside of Reisterstown?
A lot of people have said you should bring in the book. I'll have to do that. You know, so the one thing I haven't really tried to convey is my firm belief that we all live under a certain sort of regulated time. That's the time that goes fast, the time we rue when it's over. And then there is this other form of sort of touched time that you can seize for yourself that has a higher, I don't know, resonance and meaning about it. And the whole of this walk took place in that kind of time. So I now have, and I was in New York 2 nights ago, and we had a party, and the guy who took me across the Hudson in a boat was at the party. I mean, I've remained in touch, like friendship touch, with probably, I don't know, 20 people from that thing, the walk. I mean, including the Mennonites. So I was up at the same school 2 weeks ago, and 200 people came into the basement, and I talked with them, and then 50 of the kids sang songs for half an hour. And I'm like, how did I form a bond with them? I was only with them for 45 minutes 2 years ago. But they invited me up last Christmas, and I went for a Christmas concert. And I think a lot of it is if you put yourself out and you're really open and interested in other people and what they're about, they respond.
Follow-up. So when you met people, obviously you meet
Put
people.
microphone.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Did you tell them, I'm Neil King, I'm Wall Street Journal reporter, and I'm writing a book? At what point did that conversation come?
Yeah, for the most part, I kind of did that. At least I made it clear that I was walking, that I was a writer. And that became an issue later when I was writing a book, because some people I had to go back to and make sure they knew they were going to be in a book. But that's a different thing, yeah.
We have Mary Ann's coming around with a microphone.
Uh-oh.
Here we are. Right here? Yeah.
Neil, thank you for doing the walk and for sharing your story with us.
Thanks.
Really enjoyed the book and found one of the more beautiful parts of it to be the dedication to your brother, whom you said noticed things others missed. It seems in some ways this walk for you was about doing just that.
Absolutely.
Help us understand how your perspective on life perhaps changed after the walk.
Yeah. You know, one of the things that was so interesting about the reading, going back reading, was I recreated in the book, which you will know if you read it, this walk that Thomas Jefferson and James Madison took to Lake Champlain in 1792. And I was so fascinated by that thing because Jefferson had a headache and Madison had dyspepsia or something like that, and they both decided they wanted to go up there. And Jefferson's travel jottings were filled with the most incredible details. I was just like, geez. And like, they go over the mountain and they come down to Lake Champlain, and he says, we've noticed there are no more persimmon trees on this side of the mountain. And I'm like, what? Like, nobody notices the lack of persimmon trees, you know, like, and, you know, he crossed the Delaware and he wrote, I heard the first katydid. And I was like, wow. So it was spring, the first katydid. And, you know, I read a lot of Thoreau's jottings like that too, where Thoreau was famous for noting when certain flowers first bloomed and when the last leaves were on what trees at the end of the season and all of that stuff. And, you know, immersing yourself. And it's an antidote. You know, we spend so much of our time now. I'm not saying the things that we salivate over on television aren't worth being worked up about, but there's something else going on in the world that's also worth noticing. And, you know, the more you can at least counterbalance with that kind of tactile, you know, the unfolding of the seasons, the whole of it is just, and that it was an exercise in noticing.
For the most part, you were, let's forget the water bottle jerk, pretty well received.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
Did you ever think about what your reception would have been if you were a 55-year-old black man doing that walk?
I did a lot, and I wrote about that a fair bit. I have two thoughts on that subject. The one is I wouldn't for a second act as if I face less risk being what I am walking down a road than all kinds of other people, black man, woman, you could go on. I probably face the least risk of anyone, actually, in some ways, because I'm trained in this kind of thing. I'm a journalist for years. On the other hand, I would not just hesitate, but not say that any one set of, or type of person shouldn't do this. And it's really interesting. I did an event in Philadelphia, and there was a guy, probably 55-year-old black man, sitting in the front, and he asked me a question along those lines. And when I answered, he came over and introduced himself, and I knew his name because he had actually last year walked from Harriet Tubman's birthplace to the Canadian border. And he introduced himself, Ken Johnston. And I said, Ken, oh my God, we had communicated. But I hadn't met him in person. I said, why did you ask me that question? He said, I just wanted to see your response. But part of what his point was is if you're predisposed to doing something like this and feel that you're good at it, that's a different matter. I mean, on the other hand, you know, we've all seen the atrocious things that have happened in the last few weeks and that level of just like insane, if you see the world in a way that you feel fear for a person looking through your door at them and you just shoot as a result of that, that's like a mental illness, right? And that is out there. And the one thing I didn't do, by the way, when you take a walk like this, you notice that the people that are the most intent on multiple no trespassing signs generally live in houses that you would never want to go onto their property. Like, you know, or they've got like 5 cars and their dogs at the ends of chains. They're like, I'm not going to go on your property, you know. And they're like, no trespassing everywhere. It's like, no, okay.
Okay, we got it. Right, yeah.
Great. Neil, you just said it was an exercise in noticing, and I've heard you quote Mary Oliver before, attention is the beginning of devotion.
Yeah.
Life, as we all know, has a way of the noise of it, the distraction of it, the just incessant bombardment can numb us all. Having done this walk, do you feel like you can access that more quickly, more readily, that sort of paying attention, stilling yourself, and getting back to that place?
Yeah, I do. And I'm not acting as if I'm like, you know, in some higher plane or something like that. I do think it like kind of carved out a space of sorts that is accessible. But that's also, I'm not acting as if I don't give in to all the distractions that everybody else suffers from. And one of the ironies of having written this book about walking to New York is I've now spent hundreds of hours driving back and forth between these places. And you know, this morning I drove back down through most of this same territory, and you know, it's just brain dead time that is just it evaporates, you know. And that, again, going to the different forms of time spent going back and forth in a car is not remembered time. It's not time that, you know, is going to be the last thing you think about in your final moments on Earth. Weirdly enough, this walk probably will be among those moments. And, you know, it's this crystalline quality that certain stretches of time can have.
The next question is from someone who is mentioned in your book.
More than mentioned.
Bill Press, first time, long time.
Oh, yeah.
Talk
First
radio
time
reference.
A long-time listener, first-time caller.
Exactly.
Paul Woodhull, my business partner, we did a radio show for 14 years together.
Indeed, indeed. It was a great run. Neil, I've been struck by how many specific experiences you had on your journey that resonate with current events. You mentioned somebody getting shot through somebody's front door, for example. The one thing I'm thinking about is we're finally having a serious debate about solitary confinement, and you had an experience about the origination of that. Can you talk about any one of those experiences that seem to inform your opinion or your observations about any current event?
Wow.
You can use the one I gave you.
What's that?
Solitary confinement would be one example.
Okay, yeah, there is that. I mean, just to pause on that, I had to wrestle a little bit with how I would deal with the city of Philadelphia, which, of course, there's like, you could write, you know, endless books about that. So, and I decided to focus in large part on the fact that there's this really fascinating prison there called Eastern State Penitentiary, which ironically was one of the things that drew Alexis de Tocqueville to come to the United States, because he was in the U.S. to write about our prison system. And it was only when he was here looking at our prisons that he became taken by the democracy aspect of America and decided to write about that. But that, you know, at that time, solitary confinement was seen as like a very humane thing, because the alternative to it was being thrown into a place like Sing Sing, where you were surrounded by all kinds of other criminals who were going to be beating on you while you were, you know, it was like it would be like if all of us were in prison, they would just lock the doors and here we would be all together, and we would, you know, you'd always prefer to be in a solitary situation. But yeah, that's an interesting example of how our view of these things can change so much, and what something that seemed at one time to be humane becomes anything but over time, and I certainly would see it that way now.
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir. Hi, John.
Hey, Bill. Neil, what a wonderful story, and I'm waiting to hear Bill's memoirs. I'm going to come for that early. But look, in '80, around when I finished undergrad, I had the best job of my life. I traveled around the country, 44 states, selling $800 sets of cookware to single women. I did it as a hope chest item. But one thing I learned, there were these kind of regional quirks everywhere. Usually if I'm selling it, it's to her mom and her daughter. If I was, say, in the Rio Grande Valley, they would get all of their friends, their neighbors would come over, and I'd be talking to 12 or 15 people. When I was in South Louisiana, with every house I went into, and it was the only word that happened in the country, the dads would bring me a beer. When you were like north of Burlington and Durham, they have like the North Carolina, just the oddest accent I've ever heard. People sound like they have marbles in their mouth. And anyway, I'd see these quirks around the country. Did you notice, like, when you were walking around, that it seemed like, how was South Jersey different from North Jersey? How was Lancaster different from 30 miles away?
Yeah, no, I write about what I called the micronations, and I actually gave names to these various places. I called the kind of Greater Washington, Greater Capitolia, and then when I got into Maryland, it was Southlandia, because that was actually, you know, northern Maryland is actually quite southern in a lot of ways, and that area of York County as well. And, you know, going across the Susquehanna from York County into Lancaster County, I think is one of the biggest cultural leaps anywhere in the country, because you're going from a very frontier-ish place with a very different way of approaching farms and land management to this very prim and very exacting Anabaptist way of farming, and the farmhouses were like really big and proud in these huge grain silos. It was a striking difference, and I sort of trace those as I go, somewhat tongue-in-cheek. I'm walking. I'm not a sociologist, but the imprint of who settled where, when, is a very much of an ongoing feature in American life everywhere. And it may remain that way for centuries more, despite all the movement. Some of these areas just don't really change that much.
Another thing that, raise your hand if you have a question, Marianne's here with the mic. Another thing that struck me, and that you point out, is you can be walking, you're talking to the people, you're thinking about the history, but you have to sometimes stop and recognize that what's really striking is the land.
Yeah.
This
Absolutely.
land
Yeah.
of ours, this
Yeah.
beautiful land of ours, which you certainly saw a lot of and came to appreciate.
Yeah, I have one little thing at the end of the book where I kind of summarize some of my conclusions. I have a little riff on how it wasn't real. We Americans like to think it was the principles that we came across the Atlantic with, whether it was like Adam Smith or our vim and our strength and our resourcefulness and our persistence and all that. And I'm not disputing that those things were of some value. But the one thing I think we diminish is just the place that we found. And, that was, by the way, very inhabited from the first encounters all along the coastline. I think way more inhabited than a lot of people are aware. But those people had done no damage to the place. So we arrived on these shores where so much of our greatness that was to come was because of this place, right? And we've in some ways done that place relatively few favors, and we continue to do it relatively few favors.
But the beauty of the land, really.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Appreciate it. Here we go.
Anyone on this side of the room with a question?
Right here? Okay. Come around. Thank you for just waiting just a second. American Ramble. Signed by the author, by the way. Yes.
So I grew up in the West, and as you're talking about this, I'm thinking this is a very East Coast kind of a thing.
Yeah.
How do you think this trip would have been different in different parts of the U.S.?
Yeah, very. I grew up in Colorado, and I'm like fourth gen. Yeah. So one of the things is that, and I just read, by the way, there's a guy, Rinker Buck, who wrote a fantastic book called The Oregon Trail, which I couldn't recommend more, and it's such a good description of that whole passage. And he then did it with his brother in a covered wagon. It's really a fantastic story. But once you go further west, the density of the stories becomes less, and particularly when you get out into the more mountain west, there's just not as much to write about in terms of the human side of it. So you would have to travel larger distances to have kind of the narrative thread. In my case, there was all these Civil War sites. There's the construction of the railroad. There's the canals. There's all the Revolutionary War sites. There's so much that was, but I'm really drawn to doing some things out that way. So yeah.
Longer walks.
Yeah, longer walks. Yeah,
For sure.
yeah.
The American Ramble, a walk of memory and renewal. Neil King Jr. Thank you, Neil.
Thank you.
Thank you for doing the walk. Thank you for writing the book, and thanks for being here tonight.
Thank you all for being here. This is amazing, amazing.
And East City Books is here, and they will be glad to join you and sign your book for you. And thank you all for coming. We'll see you at the next edition of the Talk of the Hill. Good night. Thanks. All right.
That was fantastic. Thank you.
Are you aware of the New Jersey artists, Nancy Holt and Robert Smithson?
No.
Okay, well, Robert Smithson is famous for the spiral jetty.
Oh yeah, of course.
But he and his wife are both from New Jersey, and they tried to turn those mounds into